The tragedy in Flint, Michigan has brought national exposure to a serious problem here in the U.S., the risk of lead exposure from tap water.
Yeah, and I think it's really made all of us think, what can we do to protect ourselves and our families? Well, joining us with some answers is registered nurse Charlotte Brody. She's also the executive director of the nonprofit Healthy Babies, Bright Futures. Charlotte, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Flint, Michigan brought this issue to the forefront, but really it's a concern all over the country right now, isn't it?
It is. We know that 90 million people get their drinking water from pipes that contain lead, but we really have no idea what percentage of that 90 million have the lead coming out of the pipes and into their water supply. And that's exactly why Healthy Babies, Bright Futures is offering this lead and water testing kit, because we want people to be able to know if they have a problem so that they can solve it.
Exposure to lead is dangerous for all of us, but even more so for babies and pregnant women. Tell us more about that.
During pregnancy and in the first 2 years after birth, a baby's brain goes from a couple of cells to this incredibly complex organ, and lead just gets in the way of the wiring so that the brain isn't developed the way it's supposed to be. And we know that lead exposures can lead to learning disabilities, IQ loss, attention deficit, behavior problems, because the brain just isn't wired the way it's supposed to be.
Okay, and what are some of the symptoms of lead exposure?
Well, at very high levels of exposure, you get rashes and vomiting and seizures, but most of us won't have those kinds of symptoms. What you'll see is the very subtle, silent epidemic symptoms of loss of IQ, learning problems, difficulty in school, things that are hard to diagnose, and that's why it's so important that we do what we can to prevent these problems rather than waiting to see those kinds of difficulties years later.
All right, so how can we prevent exposure in our own homes?
Well, one thing you can do is find out if you have a lead and water problem so that you can solve it. And then there are other things you can do about the other parts of the brain drain chemical problem. Some things we need our government to do to ban chemicals in the products that our children use. But other things we can just do by ourselves. It turns out that taking your shoes off or wiping your feet before you come inside actually makes a big difference. It turns out that wet mopping really is a pretty good way to get these toxins off the windowsills, off the floors, and out of our house. But there's other things that we really need to do together, like fixing America's broken infrastructure so we don't have lead pipes that can get lead into the water in our homes.
All right, and where can we go for more information?
Go to Healthy Babies, Bright Futures website, hbbf.org, and find links to all sorts of information, including information from the federal government about how no level of lead is safe. hbbf.org.
Charlotte Brody with Healthy Babies, Bright Futures. Thank you so much for joining us and bringing us this very important information.
Thank you so much for having me.